In 2007, on a hot summer day in Baghdad, a Reuters photographer Namir and his assistant Saeed leave their office for a report. It's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon and extremely hot. Saeed carries his camera on his shoulder as he walks through the twisting alley. Namir hurries to get the car started. The street is almost empty. Only a few people are walking along the wall shadows. About an hour ago, gunfire was heard from a nearby street. But now, it's almost quiet. Nothing is heard but a helicopter hovering over the region. Suddenly, shooting breaks out in the neighborhood. Bullets fly all over the place, hitting the ground, clay walls. Vision gets weak. The fire shots continue. Bullets are shot towards Saeed, Namir, and other passerby. Everything is in chaos. In a single moment, several bodies are ripped and scattered. Screams and cries now accompany the sound of gunfire. It's a confusing situation. People are running in different directions to keep themselves safe and out of the range of the 30mm cannon bullets fired from the Apache helicopter.
He's carrying a camera. That's the camera that he has right there. They mistake it as an RPG.
In that group are two Reuters journalists from Baghdad, a photographer, Namir, and his driver and assistant, Saeed. Namir is walking towards a corner with his camera strapped over his shoulder, and the Apache asks and gets permission to engage or open fire to shoot with its 30mm cannon shells that are this big, the entire group. By that stage, there are about 9 people together, including Namir and Saeed, and they are all mowed down, all killed.
And then there's RPG standing, the guy with the RPG right here. See him carrying the RPG? And then he drops the RPG right against the wall. See, he's already wounded to keep firing on him. I don't think it was necessary. He was already wounded.
The U.S. helicopter set an attack on the Reuters photographer and his assistant continues relentlessly. Even Saeed's half-dead body crawling to a corner for cover is not spared. They want to make sure he's dead.
I can tell you from coming up on the scene, his right leg is almost taken completely off.
So what's this rule of engagement that you're not allowed to help?
It's more along the lines of the Geneva Convention. If you don't have a red crescent or a red cross on your vehicle and you go picking up the bodies, you can be fired on. Just for the simple fact that you could be picking up the bodies and the weapons as well. So, is it right? I don't think so, because clearly this guy is just trying to be a good Samaritan. I mean, he has his children in the van with him.
Where's that van at? Right down there by the body. Okay, yeah. After crazy horse, we have individuals going to the scene. Looks like possibly
The U.S. soldiers on board the Apache helicopter will not let anyone approach Namir or Saeed for help. They must not survive. So they even open fire on the vehicle of a family who has stopped to help the wounded. The father and his 2 sons inside the van are shot.
Clear. Clear.
And they're still, even though they just said that the van's disabled, they're still firing on it. Just imagine being those 2 children in there.
It must be a lovely feeling that you've saved 2 people. Whatever it is.
and we're going to come up on the scene from up here.
What time was it?
It's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Everyone else is dead. This is not a combat situation. And just before was also not a combat situation. A van then sees him driving past. Two men get out of the van and they see a man wounded on the gutter. They go to pick him up and put him in the van. In the front seat of the van you can just glimpse two children. The men rescuing Saeed look up and see the helicopter, and presumably wondering how the other people died, so they're a bit suspicious about it. The helicopter then asks for permission to open fire on a van which is collecting the wounded and collecting the dead.
I'm at the van pulling them out now. That's me running with them.
Is that with the girl, yeah?
That's the boy. Yeah, the girl was the first one, the boy was the second one. Right there, I'm talking to him.
The helicopter then pursues two pedestrians seeking refuge in a building there and gets command approval to fire missiles and destroy the building.
They then see two other men go in, both of which no sign of carrying arms, and they asked for permission to engage that building with a Hellfire missile. Now they do say they had seen 6 men go in there altogether. Sorry, before the two, so 8 men altogether into the building. However, there is not sign in the video, at least, that there have been previous men going into the building.
Overall, this attack by the Apache helicopter kills a dozen people, among them the Reuters photographer and his assistant. A year later, this terrible crime is disclosed on a website, but what WikiLeaks reveals is only a brief glimpse of reality.
See, they cut, out of this video, they cut a bunch of pieces out. Like us coming up to the van, they cut that out. The longer version.
First off, to say that there's a little bit more context to that video that's not shown, and that there were soldiers on the ground around the corner with the helicopter that was shown, so that you know, militarily speaking, the people in the Apache responded how they had been trained to. That's not to morally justify it, but that's to explain.
See that right there, that's justifying what they did. They cut out the part where they said there's a small girl wounded and he goes, oh damn, and starts showing his emotions. I think they could have done it a little bit more responsibly, WikiLeaks, the way they did it. Just the title, Collateral Murder, is a little hard to swallow, but in their video you see that they make sure to point out cameras, but they don't point out the weapons as well. This isn't all black and white, there's a lot of gray area in it, and you know, it still makes me sick to my stomach. And
the more we looked, the worse it became. And we started to see that, extraordinarily, that the two principal characters in this video, the two principal visual characters, are Namir, one Reuters journalist, who runs off into a garbage dump when he's open fired upon and is individually attacked and killed, and Saeed, who is the wounded man. So it's extraordinarily powerful visual material. And we sent people to Baghdad over the weekend to get the backstory and further evidence. We interviewed the families. We just found the children. We got their hospital records. We took photos and videotape of their scars. And we also found that the Hellfire missile attack, the third event, was on a building which had 3 families in it. We have the death certificate for the wife of the owner. And he says that there's been 2 other women were killed.
The pilot and the Apache crew's oppressive act of violence in this operation raised possibilities about the attack being planned beforehand. They talk about this mission indifferently, and none were reprimanded or taken to court afterwards.
One of the investigation reports says that the permission to engage implies, well, actually states directly that the permission to engage was only given once Namir, the photographer, went around the corner and pointed his camera in the direction of US troops and started taking a photograph. That is not true. The Apache helicopter asks for permission to engage before Namir goes around the corner, and is given permission to engage before Namir goes around the corner. So the alleged confusion of, well, he was pointing a camera towards a Bradley fighting vehicle or a Humvee, you know, an armored personnel carrier, US armored personnel carrier, 2 blocks away down the street, is false.
But the soldiers deployed to the region have a different story. They feel guilty in their own conscience when their commanders order such ruthless operations and forbid even wounded children to be taken to the hospital. 2 soldiers decide to do something to compensate their mistakes.
If I asked myself the question, you know, would I want this done to me? The answer was no. So I got to the point where I said, you know, I can't keep doing this to other people if I wouldn't want it done to me. I'm being a hypocrite if I do otherwise when I think that. So I kind of struggled with how to actually put that into action, and eventually learned about conscientious objection.
Such violent attacks constantly occur in Iraq and Afghanistan. The people in these 2 countries do not consider the presence of US troops as forces helping their country or bringing freedom and democracy for them, but as forces occupying their land.
When I talk to military audiences and they say, how come nobody ever prints in the paper a picture of an American soldier passing out candy? I said, I don't have the answer to that question, but let me take it a step farther. What is that child likely to remember more, the burned out house of his next door neighbors with the charred bodies in it, or the fact that somebody gave him a piece of candy?
You go to Walter Reed and you ask those soldiers, you know, if they're proud to do what they did, and most of them are going to say, hell yeah, because it's hard to admit to yourself that you sacrificed so much, whether it was your friends, your limbs, your eyesight, your sanity, your innocence, and tell yourself that it was all for crap. You don't want to do that. Probably the last thing that keeps you sane is the holding on to the idea that it was the noble and right thing to do, and that you help people.
Many soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan are now well aware the reason why they are in these countries is to preserve the wealth of the capitalists in Wall Street. They know that not only have they had no role in the development and freedom of these 2 countries, but that they've also have had no positive effect on preserving and guarding the security of the U.S.
We are having bases in over 100 countries around the world where people don't want us. So I think one of the measures of our security is to take a look and see, does having the largest military many times over of all the world, does having all of these bases around the world actually make us less safe rather than more safe?
The children were often barefoot running through open wastewater in the streets because, you know, at the time I still didn't understand why that was the way it was, but due to U.S. bombings during the Gulf War and periodically through the 90s that destroyed the sanitation systems, the water systems, everything. So Iraq was just poor.
I need him to stand because
U.S. forces raids on people's homes in Iraq and Afghanistan and the growing number of civilian casualties have triggered a wave of anger and hatred against the inhuman acts of the U.S. government, both in this region and around the world. These imprudent acts have extended the roots of terrorism in different countries, and insecurity throughout the world has peaked ever since.
Terrorism was created in Iraq by the Western Alliance and the United States. In fact, in Afghanistan, terrorism was started by the CIA and their friends in the region there when they were arming Osama bin Laden and his groups, and these groups, in order to fight the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union was defeated, they cut and ran without taking care of the people of Afghanistan, and they left the country to Osama bin Laden and Taliban to rule. So I don't think they are fighting terrorism. They are not fighting for democracy.
In Iraq, I saw the completely opposite experience. I was hurting people. I was kicking down their doors. I was building distrust from the people I was supposedly bringing democracy to, and I saw that I was not being seen as a peacekeeper, but I was seen as an occupier and invader.
Since 2003, we're not including the years of bombings and sanctions that killed over 1 million Iraqis prior to the invasion of 2003. But if anyone was to think that this is for the liberation of the Iraqi people, when all you did was bomb the country mercilessly, kill over almost 1.5 million people, and then continue to repress and police the civilian population, kicking down people's doors in the middle of the night, dragging them out of their homes, sending them to detention facilities where they're tortured on absolutely no charge, there's no one who can actually go to that country and actually think that we're there for the Iraqi people.
You think about a country, or Iraq, for example, 25 million people before the invasion. We've killed well over 1 million, probably closer to 1.5 million. 1/25 of the population dead. At least 5 million have been either internally displaced or refugee. At least. That is a very conservative figure. That's, 1/5 of the population before the war, now displaced. We're talking about at least, minimum, 6 to 7 million people dead or displaced in a country that only started out with 25 million people. That is such an astronomical figure that it's hard to really wrap your mind around it. Not to mention the infrastructure damage that we did.
He was accused of killing 400,000 people in the 30 years that he was in power. The United States killed 400,000 Iraqis in the first 6 months we were there. We're far more efficient at killing Iraqis than Saddam Hussein ever was.
That 1/3 of the Taliban are there because of revenge from foreign forces, not just America, but other foreign forces that have either killed their father or brother, or illegally detained their father and brother, or displaced them from their lands, and now they're upset, and so they join the Taliban because they want to fight foreign forces. So of course to them we could look like terrorists to them.
As protests against the U.S. government's inhumane acts are on the rise, violent and coercive methods are used to quell these protests in the occupied countries, in the USA itself, and even amongst intellectuals of this country. While U.S. military forces persecute people with all kinds of torture in Iraq and Afghanistan, police and security forces inside the U.S. crush protests with intimidation.
Between January and May of 2007, I was warned by my chain of command to curtail my political activities in order to remain within Army regulations, which I did according to my reasonable interpretation of the orders I received. I quickly realized that the problem was not the manner in which I was exercising my First Amendment rights, but the substance of the speech itself. Suspended, and I was involuntarily discharged. I did not pursue an IG complaint for fear that I would be further retaliated against.
You know, they referred to the Iraqi people as Hajis and could care less when we killed civilians. It was not, it was brushed off, and it was like, well, how does this affect our force? It was never, how does this affect the Iraqi people? The things that we're doing, how is this affecting the Iraqi people? When we lost electricity, it was about, well, my air conditioner's down. It wasn't about, well, the Iraqi people don't have electricity for most of their day.
I tried to contact a lot of local news media to talk about not only this incident, but my whole experience in Iraq and what I thought of it. And nobody would give me the forum. Nobody talked to me. I'd never gotten any return phone calls or anything. But as soon as the WikiLeaks video came out, then everybody got a taste of war and everybody wants to know what's going on.
We got hold of the 2003 manual for Guantanamo Bay, which was authored by the then commander, General Miller. That is the same general who went to Abu Ghraib and set up Abu Ghraib in response to a request by Donald Rumsfeld saying, go to Abu Ghraib and Gitmoise it. Turn it into another Gitmo. Take the lessons you have learned in Guantanamo Bay and apply them to Abu Ghraib. And those abuses in Abu Ghraib occurred after that. So it's very interesting to sort of look at the progression of this abuse. And we see for the initial 2003 manual for Guantanamo that there was a policy of hiding people from the Red Cross for 1 month, a breach of the Geneva Conventions.
That what occurred at Abu Ghraib was not an aberration, and it was not a bunch of bad apples on the night shift. What we saw was directly correlated with the policies, procedures, and the implementation of a torture program that was okayed at the very highest level of the American government, from the White House and the Pentagon, and those policies trickled down to Guantanamo Bay. They went through the CIA's so-called black site secret prisons. They showed up at Bagram in Afghanistan, and they showed up on paper and then on film in Abu Ghraib.
I remember my friend Magdad from the Iraqi police station in Hib. I got to talking to him a lot, and after Abu Ghraib scandal occurred, he's just stopped talking to me. And this went on for maybe like 3 weeks, that he just ignored me, he wouldn't talk to me. He was really upset. He was upset mostly about the Quran being defiled than of the naked human pyramids and the dogs and the torture and all that crap.
After the election of President Obama, whose main presidential campaign slogan was change, Americans and other people around the world expected change in the tragic situation in Iraq and Afghanistan. But unfortunately, so far, no sign of improvement has been witnessed.
The Obama administration says it has stopped the torture program in the United States. That is true on paper. In other words, Obama has signed an executive order that has stopped the torture program, at least as carried out by the CIA. The problem is that that's just a piece of paper. In other words, that is this president's policy to not torture, okay? Most of the, say, Republican presidential potential candidates for 2012 have all advocated torture. Under the Obama administration, not only are they the same as during the Bush administration, they're arguably worse. While the Obama administration is ostensibly not torturing people, they have increased the troop footprint in Afghanistan. They have drastically increased the use of unmanned drone strikes in countries other than Afghanistan and Iraq. And these are very aggressive national security policies that have that run the risk of a serious backlash against the Obama administration.
The Army Registration Office at St. Louis High School in Washington, D.C. is one of the most active offices for drawing the youth to war. Every month, the Army and the Pentagon give sums of money to schools throughout the U.S., and in return, Army registration offices are set up in schools. They give forms to young adult students in order to draw and enroll more forces in the Army and send them to fight in Iraq or Afghanistan. But what is propagated in these advertisements and what the officers in charge of the recruitments describe to the high school students differs greatly from the harsh realities of the Army and war.
Wanting to meet ladies, you know, they definitely talked to me about the potential of traveling overseas. I didn't really think about it in context of going to war at the time. I thought, you know, I might go to Europe or Asia, and I wound up going to both places. But you know, it was not this picture of a military at war was not painted to me.
Because the high schools have, by law, to get federal funding, they must have the recruiters in the building. Okay? Go listen. What I'm going to tell you is go listen. They're still doing the same type of argument now that they were doing 7 years ago, 8 years ago. The lies, deceit, the deception of the military recruiters was exactly what I told them. That's the part I resented. So they caught my son under false pretenses. And they caught many, many others under false pretexts. If they had told my son and the others the truth, okay, then a decision could have been made with foresight. He was an 17, 18-year-old child, as what they are doing right now.
Target identified. Element search for Hotel Victor Tangos, 2 and 8. Execute assault time now.
In fact, the Army's promotional activities are pretty much deceptive. The energy and enthusiasm of the youth is exploited through promises of exciting activities and facilities. The Army staff responsible for recruiting new troops never conveys the whole reality of war. Volunteers are employed with false hopes.
I went down to the Marine recruiter one day and I said, I want to join. But I was too young. I was only 17, so he sent me back to my mother and said, your parents have to sign guardianship away to the military. You can go into the military if you're 16 or 17.
You know, it's a long time ago. They didn't really tell us that much. I mean, there was the recruitment process in the military is very macho, I would say, and you know, there's this excitement on the fact that you're going to go kill someone. I mean, it's that simple. Like, I can remember being at the recruitment station, and the recruiter was telling these other people that came in, like, James here, he's going to be an infantry ranger. He's going to kill some people. He's going to be on this poster right here on the wall. You know, it's like, this is the kind of recruitment.
Well, if you come here, you get to blow. And of course, as a 17-year-old boy, who doesn't want to blow really? Like, that's what you grow up at G.I. Joe and the explosions on TV and Schwarzenegger and all that action movies. And I mean, that's pretty much a dream for a little kid. So, and that's what I was still at 17. I was a kid. And so I signed up right on the spot. I didn't even realize at the time that I could go in the Marines and still blow up. I could do explosives in the Marines. I didn't have to go there. Didn't care. Signed up right on the spot, no questions asked. My mom was happier about that. She still wasn't quite happy, but she was happier in the sense that, you know, in her opinion, the National Guard didn't go to war.
What's the definition of leadership?
Man, the definition of leadership is to motivate young adults to become better citizens, man! Ho!
Families have different reasons when they send their children to the Army. Many of them consider lack of job opportunities, unemployment, and poverty as the main motives for their children to join the military. These very young individuals have to serve a period in the Army to provide their university tuition. But joining the Army and going to war crosses out all hopes for continuing their education.
I had no money for college. I had no real job opportunities, no job skills. All of these things played a huge part into why I went into the military, and it's why a majority of the people go into the military. If we look at the advertising campaigns for the military, it's not come be a patriot. It's come learn this job, come get money for college. The things that I did in Iraq, I was not thinking about anyone in the United States and if I was protecting them. I was sent to Iraq. I had orders, or I would have been arrested and going to jail if I didn't go to Iraq.
The vast majority of people who join the military don't join because they want to go to war. They join because there's no jobs for young people when they get out of high school. They join because there are families who can't give their kids health care, who can't pay their rent, who can't pay their mortgage, who need a place to live. There are people who need the things that we all deserve.
We had a lot of Latinos who were told that they would become citizens. And you hear about it in the news right now that people's families are being deported after the soldier has been killed. And at that moment, I was 23 years old. I had lived on my own for so long, and I was living with my parents again because I just recently wrecked my car and whatnot. And so I was back in school when the towers were hit, and it was the way to get out. It was the only way that I really knew how to get out and try and get on my own. So I enlisted.
A feature of this military call-up is the pressure there is on the National Guard troops to join the deployed forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. The National Guard troops were usually used in urban operations and have a different responsibility than that of the military and armed forces. But in recent years, they have been forced to serve some time in Iraq or Afghanistan, or else go to prison if they refuse.
Like I said, like these Guard units had not been called up, and then you'll call a group of them, say from where my son lives, in Wilkes-Barre. They'll say they need 100 people out of Wilkes-Barre, and then they'll take them and put them into the Army. Okay. So they're integrated then into an Army unit. And that's what happened to him. It was when the war began in '03, we were very afraid that he might be affected, but we honestly didn't think he would be called into battle in Iraq.
That's definitely that's how they presented the situation. They presented it as either you go to war or go to jail, in essence. And you know, I chose, at least in the short term, war, and fortunately I only was led into hostile situations.
The U.S. propaganda apparatus showcases their enemies as barbarians and uncivilized, and that U.S. soldiers are sent to these countries to bring culture and civilization. This arrogant attitude towards other cultures leads young, inexperienced Americans to assume Iraqis or Afghans to be primitive or barbaric. This disparaging mindset ultimately has soldiers thinking that killing such people is not so big a deal, let alone a crime.
We have been brainwashed into such fear, and here, there's a greater likelihood that you and your film crew will walk out on the street and get killed by a car than you would ever be damaged by a terrorist. And that's what Americans don't understand. And so this is all, this fear, this warmongering is all to sustain, as you point out, the greed that is nurtured by the military-industrial complex.
I remember, going there and we were all kind of shocked because we had been indoctrinated with this idea that it was just kind of this backward country that couldn't run itself, and we had to go in there and show them how to live their lives.
I think a lot of it is to brainwash a little bit, to make you understand that, you're infantry, you're American, you're better than everybody else, and when you go to war, you need to dehumanize these other people and see them as not human so that you can do your job and kill without remorse.
I feel that our country's given us so many great things. We have to give something back. And in order to keep the federal republic that we have, in order to keep the free enterprise and capitalist system that's been so great for the rest of the world, you have to defend it. And the only way you can defend it is by having a strong military.
So I joined wanting to do good, wanting to help people, really believing in my country and being patriotic and believing what the United States stood for.
To serve my country, and after looking over the combat jobs for my country, I realized that there's nobody better or stronger to do this job than me. And that's why I chose to do Field Artillery Forward Observer, because if somebody's going to be on the front lines, I wouldn't want anybody other than me to be there. And that's why I signed up after 9/11, to go protect my country and our freedoms.
I believed in it so much. And then after I went to Iraq, I knew that I couldn't be a part of that anymore. I really realized what the real role of the U.S. military is in the world.
It was down in New York City, and anything that I could get my hands on I was reading, and then even the time period after this. And over the next year, what I really started to realize was that the U.S. isn't the good guys. I'd always grown up thinking that we were the good guys. And as a soldier, I always thought of myself as a good guy, as the G.I. Joe type figure who's going to run in and save the day.
I think that America is above torturing and kidnapping. Examples, 23 CIA just got convicted in Italy for torturing and kidnapping. Well, guess where the orders came from? The top. You know what I mean? They were convicted in an Italy court. So, I mean, that's just obviously, that's how we looked at over in Italy. Probably not good, you know? I mean, how would you look at somebody that just... America does what the hell they want, when the hell they want to do it. It's all behind the scenes. I don't know what exactly the reasons are, whether it's the poppy production, the drug money in Afghanistan, the oil in Iraq.
The American youth who joined the Army with no previous knowledge and with different motivations suddenly face bitter realities when they're deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. Those who have entered the Army hoping to serve people become extremely disillusioned and frustrated after some time, but immediate withdrawal from the Army is not possible.
All the reasons why they tell you to join, they usually flip around on you, and it's the opposite reasons why you need to stay. So be all you can be, get an education, learn skills that will help you in the real world, become a man, become independent, all this other stuff.
I really tried to make every single soldier who was getting out feel guilty for not re-enlisting, and they'd show us pictures of 9/11, and they'd show us pictures of soldiers who were deployed and say, you know, how can you get out at a time like this?
You know, I mean, in the Army I was like 185 pounds, and I would weigh in on the scales at almost 300 pounds with all the weight that I would carry on my back, with radio, 20 pounds of water, extra batteries, food, different stuff like this. And I was like, it was kind of funny because, like, well, it wasn't funny. I mean, it was breaking me off physically. There's two parts, the physical and the mental part of what you're doing over there.
In addition to the pressure of obeying the inhuman orders of military commanders, other things torture U.S. soldiers' mind and physique as well. To mention but a few, class discrimination, racial discrimination, and the compulsion to do things that endanger their health.
One of the squad leaders, who was actually my squad leader, he said, raise your hand if you're not going to take the anthrax vaccination. And immediately I put my hand up, and there were about 7 or 8 other young men that did as well. Immediately, since he was my squad leader, he said, "Tricello, put your hand down." I said, "No, Sergeant, I'm not taking it." So, you know, they pressured us. Everyone cracked and took it except myself and another young man. And they sent us to jail. It's that clear. And, you know, it didn't appear that way to a lot of people at first because, you know, it looks like it's the United States military and the government protecting soldiers. But what it did was put thousands at risk because these vaccinations are known to cause, you know, dramatic problems in people, and especially for those that want to have children in the future, you know.
So I would say the vast majority of people in the military now don't want to fight and kill and die endlessly in Iraq and Afghanistan, but they feel that they have to. They feel that they're obliged to. They have no other option.
The military personnel are around 60,000, I think, and the contractors are over 100,000. So that's a discrepancy right there. You're paying contractors 5 to 10 times what the military is getting paid to do the same job and have much better benefits than the military people do.
Because now they have paid mercenaries over there making 10 times what our troops do. You have over 70,000 mercenaries in Afghanistan alone. Now, what are these people loyal to? American values or a paycheck? Now, you tell me.
If a soldier wants to leave the army, he has several obstacles. If he leaves the draft unfinished, he will face prosecution and imprisonment. And if he wants to leave the army after the allotted period comes to its end, still, various methods are used to prevent his separation from the army.
I was separated with a general discharge, which theoretically would disqualify me from any education benefits and make me liable for the money that I had previously received through the GI Bill. There were 2 other Marines in the IRR who were subject to the same harassment at the same time. The way that the Marine Corps Mobilization Command came after me was illegal, the decision of the separation board was legally faulty, and it was a clear-cut case of political harassment. Although we were able to achieve what seemed like wrestling things to a tie, the Marine Corps was able to send 2 very strong messages. We don't want you speaking out against the occupation, or even portraying the reality of everyday life in Iraq, and even if you're in the inactive reserves, we can still control your fate.
I gave a press conference and I said, you know, I'm Sergeant Giroux and I'm not going to Iraq because I think it's unconstitutional and I think it's racist and immoral, and furthermore, I'm not going to hide and I'm not leaving the country. I'm just going to go back to Brooklyn, and if you want to come get me, come get me.
When I watched those hearings and the testimonies that other soldiers were giving, to realize that, you know, my experiences weren't that unlike some of the people testifying there. So it looked like a organization that would be helpful to join. So I joined.
I ended up turning myself back into Fort Hood in August of 2006. In February of 2007, I was sentenced to 7 months of military confinement at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. I ended up serving 5 months of this and was given a bad conduct discharge. It seems to me that the process of proving conscientious objection is difficult in an all-volunteer army, especially for a 20-year-old.
The first time my stepfather drove me to the Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where we got there on a Friday evening and they told us to come back on a Monday morning to turn myself in. So that opened my stepfather's eyes to the fact that they didn't even care. I think it's a contradiction to give me an honorable discharge for an illegal war against not only 1 but 2 countries at the same time. So
Robin was one of the soldiers who refused to finish his draft. He had to escape to Canada, but the Canadian government arrested him and returned him to the U.S. The story of how the military court treated Robin is one of the strangest and cautionary stories of this period in America. Robin's court trial was concurrent with the trials of some of his military comrades who had committed war crimes during their presence in the war. Interestingly, the court announced Robin's sentence was heavier than those of his comrades.
I testified actually at Robin's court-martial. Robin was given orders to Iraq, I think half a decade ago, and wound up going to Canada. and was the first U.S. citizen, U.S. soldier to be deported from Canada back to the U.S. to face trial.
Mhm.
And so they deported him, and he was tried in Colorado. And I showed up. It was a couple months after I'd refused to deploy, to actually testify on his behalf. You know, and I testified on the stand to the lawyer, or to the judge, and said, look, you know, you're trying to put Robin in jail for 3 years for doing something that I did just a month ago, and I'm free to tell the tale. You know, this seems a little, you know, what's the disconnect here?
Such actions by the U.S. government and judicial system have worried many American thinkers and intellectuals. They, on the one hand, consider the war policies of their country as inhuman and ineffective, and on the other, face a war and a huge number of victims.
You know, and I don't feel like if I die doing what I did there, you're no safer now than before I died. As a matter of fact, you're less safe because you just lost one of your best combat soldiers. And that's why these wars, they're making America less safe, because they're killing our good combat soldiers that no good is going to come from these wars and what's going on. Fraze is my best friend that was killed. His daughter was 6 months old when he was killed. This guy was my mortar team. He was killed by an RPG in Iraq. You know, these are all my buddies. This is the only person on my arm that I don't know.
A lot of times they'd say to me, hey, Mom, they used to call me Mom, make sure we get night vision goggles. We have terrible night vision goggles, so when you get up on the podium, tell them we want night vision goggles. Then there was a period of time where they had no body armor. In the very beginning, their body armor was terrible. So they'd call me, or when I got on the phone with them, they'd say, we need body armor. And, you know, I had to buy my son body armor before he went on his second tour, because he said his helmet was like a tin can, and the body armor he had didn't cover him. It was just a plate in his chest. I spent $3,000 on getting high-tech body armor because he was on the ground as a grunt.
I'm going to do that using my music to pay tribute to my friends that were killed in these wars. I'm not going to let their memory be forgotten. I'm not going to let people forget what was lost. If I don't talk about it, who is? So many people, so many good people, stories will not be told, and I feel like I'm obligated to tell their stories for them.
post-traumatic stress disorder is a mysterious condition that has grounded many veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. The abbreviation PTSD stands for a variety of mental, physical, and movement disorders in soldiers who have apparently returned from the war in full health, but are completely distraught and traumatized from within. The prevalence of this horrifying disorder is so high that some doctors suggest symptoms of the disease are observed in all American combat veterans.
I personally focus and work mostly with people who have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And this has been the case with almost all war veterans. Of course, they could suffer from other illnesses as well. And PTSD almost always is accompanied by another diagnosis. Always there's a depression that goes along with the PTSD. There's always a mood disorder that accompanies PTSD.
Yeah, well, you can't really say that there's one thing that causes PTSD. I think it is an accumulation of the thing. Number one, we have to look at the fact that the military is a very racist and sexist organization. When you are in basic training, you are taught to kill and insert your favorite racial slur or ethnic slur here to refer to the people, the Middle Eastern people, the Asian people. It's the same using the N-word to our African American friends.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is one of the leading problems among our soldiers coming back. Now, we've got Marines that are going on 4 and 5 combat tours. We've got Army soldiers that are going on 3 and 4 year-long combat tours. And post-traumatic stress disorder and suicide are closely correlated. You have soldiers that are coming back that are operating on just a hair trigger, extreme violence. In other words, they have an impulse to kill themselves and they have an impulse to kill other people, and that's a known problem that happens with people who are suffering from extreme PTSD.
Most of the people I knew and some pretty close friends who really struggled with PTSD were the ones who didn't really have anybody to talk about their frustrations with, and instead they would turn to things like alcohol and buying a new car or a big screen TV and just trying to put those memories behind them rather than think about what they did and try and learn from it one way or another.
I left in November of 2007. I was injured, though the Army was saying I wasn't. I was in 3 IED explosions, and my back was messed up real bad. I tried to go to the doctor there on the fob, and he didn't even look at me. He just told me it was muscle spasms and not to worry about it. I knew it wasn't muscle spasms, but what can you do, In Iraq, that something else was wrong with me because my speech was slowing down. I was having extreme headaches. I was forgetful about everything, and they also found out in Fort Riley that I had traumatic brain injury and severe chronic PTSD. But the doctors wouldn't look at me in Iraq.
Although PTSD has a wide-scale impact on the soldiers, their families, and even individuals in the society, patients suffering from this disorder are not properly treated with attention and care. Some hospitals refuse to admit PTSD patients because the disorder is relatively unknown. And the military hospital's negligence and lack of proper treatment lead to the continuation and deterioration of the PTSD patient's condition. This is how American soldiers who for their country risk their health and peace of mind and that of their families are ignored by the U.S. government and military officials.
And I still haven't been approved for my VA claim. I've had to work full-time even though my pain level is so high that some days I can't even get out of bed. But I have to work full-time because I have bills to pay. I can't just stop eating because of that, but I don't get disability compensation because I was turned down.
To the VA hospital, and they don't really direct you. You have to ask questions. And if you don't ask the right questions, you don't know what to do with yourself or go anywhere. There's no advocates for veterans. And I used to go with him. And then finally, he kind of crashed and burned last summer. He had a meltdown, a very bad meltdown, and I took him to the VA, and we found someone in the VA who kind of took a liking to my son and helped him through the system. But that's not, unless you're lucky, you don't find that. They don't have people standing there saying, let me help you.
I have a lot of health issues that stem from Iraq, and I also have been turned down for all of my veterans benefits. I applied for 9 disabilities to include both of my knees, my hips, my back, my lungs, my eyesight, my hearing, traumatic brain injury, and post-traumatic stress. I put in an application because I thought, again, a little bit too trusting of the way things work.
I have anger issues in dealing with a lot of general public, as well as my back. I can't sit too long or stand too long without being in pain and discomfort, and so there's not much I can do.
Do you feel like you've been let down a lot by the government?
I feel like I've been, first off, used by the government for my ideals in military, to be sent to a war that had nothing to do with us, and I feel used for it.
Almost always fall on deaf ears. It's very difficult to convince, because people are more interested in locking up people, putting them away. It's easier, but more expensive.
I have 3 friends that I deployed with who, might have been able to control things for a little while, but at one point or another ended up in mental institutions. And yeah, I mean, the media or the rhetoric can be a lot of, support the troops, but I think most people have, a very specific thing they want. Has not only on them, but on society and on their families. And, families are getting torn apart after people come back just because of the stress and those psychological issues. And yeah, it just takes, a heavy toll on society as a whole.
And I would call up his reserve unit and say, isn't there something we could do? Is there anywhere he could go? And they're like, no, ma'am. No, ma'am, we don't know. We don't have any services. Tell him to go to the VA hospital. He goes to the VA hospital. There's nothing they could do for him. If he needs psychological help, he has to go through a whole battery of psychological tests. And it takes months.
Attending to the problems of the returning Iraq and Afghanistan veterans is so inadequate in the U.S. that some military hospitals attempt to conceal the realities of the issue, as far as trying to get rid of the PTSD-affected soldiers via immoral and inhuman procedures. For instance, in many cases, harmful and cancer-causing drugs have been prescribed for PTSD patients, a hazard to their health. It has also been observed that alcohol and addictive drugs have been recommended and prescribed for such patients.
From 2000 to 2001, I was employed as a pharmacist at the Tucson Veterans Affairs Hospital. The events of greatest concern to me that I personally witnessed pertain to patient safety as follows. Seriously flawed cardiac arrest resuscitations, cancer chemotherapy overdose, and several other less egregious complaints, including one that was particularly of concern to me, employees taking grossly extended breaks rather than focusing on their jobs to care for the veteran patients.
Soldiers and Marines are coming back from repeated tours from Iraq and Afghanistan, suffering extreme mental duress from combat. They are not getting the help that they deserve in terms of counseling. They're getting a lot of drugs given to them. They're being treated as disciplinary problems, and it's often resulting in suicides and murders.
I was initially afraid to approach my superiors with my concerns because I was a fairly new hire. I was still within the probationary period of my employment. However, I eventually decided to meet with my superiors individually and privately, working the chain of command as I was expected to do. When it became apparent that none of my superiors were following up with a response to the concerns that I expressed, I filed a whistleblower complaint with the Office of Inspector General, the VA Office of Inspector General, and the U.S. Office of Special Counsel. I was terminated from the hospital 12 days later.
What's happening is they're coming back from these wars, they're getting handed a bunch of pills to take for their problems, their commands are calling them and wimps that they can't handle the war, and they end up acting out.
The situation is even worse for female veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. They suffer deeper and more extensive problems and are subjected to serious mental and emotional disorders. Many of them complain about sexual assaults during their presence in these countries and suffer from severe depression after their return.
I'm thinking that women are exposed to additional traumas while they are, apparently they have been exposed to possible sexual harassment and maybe even rape, those kind of issues. But frankly, I would be very worried about women who have left little children behind. Do seek psychiatric help because of trauma, early trauma. The most frequent reason for women to seek treatment is early trauma. Early kind of issues that have impacted their lives, and they develop one or another kind of a psychiatric illness. It is not necessarily PTSD, but it could be any other kind of an illness.
I'm representing a client right now. With her permission, we're going to submit her information of what happened to her at the advent of the war on terrorism, where she was a cook at Fort Carson, Colorado, and she was physically assaulted, and she claims that she was raped. And she tried to report this, and an E8, which is a high-up non-commissioned officer, actually kept her from reporting it to keep everything quiet, to the point where she had such mental trauma, which is documented in her medical records.
If you look at the people returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, the reason that they're different are many of them are female, many of them are older as service personnel, meaning that their experience wasn't as an 18 and 19-year-old, it was as a 30-year-old. So that's going to be different as well.
They have hired many more mental health professionals to work with them, but I don't know how, if there's enough of them to deal with that many casualties. It looks like the casualties are significant.
The American veterans returning home from Iraq and Afghanistan are themselves a problem and cause of insecurity in the society. They carry with themselves bitter memories and harsh, horrifying experience. This has provoked many of them to turn to alcohol and drugs as refuge.
Most of the vets I've met to then were severe post-traumatic stress cases, most of them using drugs and alcohol, and I've been a straight-edge kid my whole life. To this day, I've never had a sip of alcohol. The only drugs that I use are prescription drugs. I'm very much, have always favored not using, and so I really hated a lot of the people that were self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. I hate seeing drunks, it really annoys me. And it was in the veterans community, there's a lot of drinking, a lot of it.
That of the 2 million or so people who have served in Iraq or Afghanistan, that anywhere between 20 to 30% of them will show symptoms of PTSD. Some of those symptoms are inability to keep a job, anger issues, spousal abuse, drug and alcohol abuse, suicidal tendencies, homelessness. The rate of homelessness for current vets is 2 to 3 times the national average for that age group. The rate of suicide for the current veterans is 6 times the national average for that age group.
They're giving them medicated drugs. You got depression, take drugs. That's what they wanted to do for me when I got back, because I told them about some of how I thought in my mind. And their answer to that was, here, you need to take drugs. I said, well, I'm not taking drugs, okay? and that, I don't know. It's just a cycle of just mess, and it's a tragedy what's going on.
In the Marine Corps, I know because my son has told me, they'll come in and they'll talk to them about their deployments, and they'll say, now you guys have seen some pretty awful things. You've seen your buddies die. You've seen people die. Take all of that neatly and put it in a box. And take that box and tuck it behind your heart. And don't think about it anymore. It's away. It's gone. This is what the Marine Corps tells them. And they say, okay, see ya. And they send them out. And when he got out, he came home. And that was it.
A considerable number of soldiers victimized like this in Iraq and Afghanistan wars are prone to severe depression and despair after a period of drug and alcohol addiction. They eventually resort to suicide. The suicide rate in the U.S. military has risen exponentially. The death toll from suicides among the returning American veterans even exceeds the combat death toll.
Trying to wonder why I was, waking up in the middle of the night to any random sound, and trying to wonder why I had to, every time I saw a small girl, I had to think of the young girls I dragged from their homes by the arm and threw out to the street who were crying their eyes out and begging us to leave them alone. I was wondering why every time I saw an older man, I had to think of men that we tortured in our detention facilities. All these things that I couldn't get my mind off of. I had to understand why I was a part of them. And
that there's an enormous amount of soldiers out there and veterans who feel hopeless. I think there are soldiers in the military that feel like their situation is hopeless, both materially and spiritually in a sense. They feel rotten or destroyed somehow, and even outside, there's this the military to me breaks existence down into this awful dichotomy of either being, totally hyper achievement, or you're just better off dead.
In the last few months, the suicide rate of veterans and active duty soldiers was so high that more soldiers were losing their lives from suicide at their own hand than on the battlefield. That's a sign that the people have been traumatized by their experience.
A veteran suicide, because I relate to everything except pulling the trigger. I think it's the most selfish thing in this world you can do, to leave the people behind that you love because you can't deal with whatever it is.
And extremely, it's the ultimate. It's the solution for feeling absolutely hopeless and not getting the kind of support people will need, and it's more common here again because of the, I think, individualistic, and then maybe in some societies where religion still plays a significant role. You will talk to a Muslim, let's say, and I treat many Muslims, a Muslim, and they say, I thought of suicide, but I will never do it because, I'm not supposed to. It's interesting. You don't hear that from other religions that frequently, but it is, he is deterred, the person is deterred by his, Islamic teachings.
Meanwhile, the families of war veterans who have endured much pain and agony have taken action themselves. They have come to each other's help by setting up volunteer counseling and treatment groups to try to compensate the negligence of the officials. These families try to take care of their children in any possible way. They are in contact with each other and endeavor to solve the problems of their soldier children. Some of them, who have lost their kids to suicide, try to prevent the reoccurrence of this bitter incident, among other returning depressed veterans.
And if you send a human being to war again and again and again and again, and they see killing, and they do killing, and they see people killed, they will come back and they will be damaged good.
I don't know as much as Kevin and Joyce Lucy would know because they've delved into it because of their son, okay? But this is all how things evolve through military families speak out, speaking with each other, thinking about what were the signs for, let's say, for them, for suicide.
One of the main reasons is that the military has done a very poor job preparing for this influx of extremely ill people. There's not enough doctors, there's not enough resources, there's inability among the command, in other words, the people that command these troops, to understand what the problem is among their own troops. And of course, if you treat somebody like they're a bad soldier when they have a mental problem, they end up acting out in very bad ways.
I'm sure it's not a very powerful group of people who can speak, you know, I mean, for themselves. It's not. It really is not. So, you know, it's not a very, you know, strong lobby. What kind of a lobby? You know, everything in this country happens by lobbying.
The message of many of these returned soldiers is that they don't understand why we're there, that the people there don't want us there, that we don't understand the culture, we don't understand the traditions, we don't understand the customs, and that it's really crazy to think that we could social engineer somebody else's society. We have a hard enough time here at home. We have veterans who are homeless, sleeping literally on these benches like the one I'm sitting on right now. We can't take care of our own people. What makes us think we can go and build democracy somewhere else? And I think a lot of the returning soldiers are coming home very traumatized by what they have seen, what they have done, by the realization.
Now the American people, especially the victims of the two horrific wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, know that the two destructive wars have had no positive outcome for Americans. Destruction, irreparable damage to Iraq and Afghanistan, extensive blows to the U.S. economy, and the injury and death of thousands of American soldiers are what these two devastating wars have entailed. Still, the White House leaders persist in war.
And this is what I would be telling the parents. You got to live through the war. Your child has to come back because they're going to war. There's not a doubt they're going to war.
Many American mothers are now grieving the loss of their children, children who have been victimized in wars with Iraq and Afghanistan merely for the government's desire for domination. The mothers of war veterans are deprived of the least social and natural rights that ought to be granted to them. Having sacrificed their most valuable assets, the fruit of years of selfless care and devotion, these mothers have been victimized by the stubborn and wrong policies of the U.S. administration.
And when I say a loss, let me define a loss. A loss could be, in my case, it's a child. They could have the loss in the fact that their child did not come back the way they went. Okay, over. And to define that would be also, this PTSD. There's legs, there's limbs, there's injuries. There's so many things that are dealt with differently.
They pulled people who were in the National Guard from across the country. And so he was told in the latter part of '03 that his unit would be called upon, but he didn't know if it was him or somebody else.
Well, it's interesting. My son joined the Marine Corps in 1999. He always wanted to be a Marine, so it was pretty well accepted in the family, except for me. I grew up in the 60s, so I understood completely what the Vietnam War did, and I tried to talk him out of it, but something he always wanted to do.
So they caught my son under false pretenses, and they caught many, many others under false pretexts. If they had told my son and the others the truth, okay, then a decision could have been made with foresight. He was an 17, 18-year-old child, as what they are doing right now, who, excuse me, I'm sorry, young man, but you can't make up your own minds. You don't know your A from your elbow, okay? And you're a kid, okay? It's simple.
We don't feel that the military, the way it is necessary. It's overbloated. It's they do things that shouldn't be done, and I didn't want my son trained in the ways of killing.
We talked about it a lot, and he was very conflicted. So I told him that if he wanted to get out of it, I would do everything I could. I would take him to Canada. I would do anything I could to get him out of it, because I thought it was wrong. I thought it was stupid, I mean, I didn't at any point agree with an invasion of Iraq, and he was smart, and he was political, and he hadn't voted for Bush, and it wasn't like he wanted to go to war, but he made a commitment, and he felt very strongly about his commitment and about the people he served with.
Notice I used the word killed, did not die. Seth was killed. There's a big difference. There was a $12,000 debt that was owed to college, which they had told my son, oh, we'll pay your loans off, we'll do everything. They never did it. They never did it. They just, Rutgers, which is where he went, just said, forget about it. It's a done issue. So in that respect, I was not for my son going into the service whatsoever. And I knew that there was going to, in the back of my own mind, there was going to be a war. Even though they had told him, war? No, not happening.
Multiple deployments for a family is really what takes its toll. Some, I think in the beginning, people with children in the military or family members in the military didn't like the idea of them going to war, but everyone had this sort of nationalistic pride that we have to get our revenge, we have to find the person who perpetrated this, and bring them to justice. I mean, that was the whole theory behind the invasion of Afghanistan, bringing people to justice that perpetrated 9/11. But after 6 months, I realized that wasn't what was going to happen. And I think a lot of military families thought the same way.
I mean, I still don't know why you would make a military decision to take civilians, basically civilian soldiers who, you know, who had training one weekend a month and then 2 weeks in the summer. That was his whole training. And he was a social worker. That was his regular job.
These families suffer from the problems caused by physical and mental injuries of their veteran children. And they dread the reaction of the government security officers.
I do know that I meet moms when I'm at an anti-war protest, but they're afraid to speak out. Some of them will eventually come forward, but they say, oh, I don't want to upset my son or daughter or husband.
That it was disloyal, that it was insulting to my son, that I was Al-Qaeda sympathizer, that I was, all the stuff that people still say, the hateful stuff that people, because they can't understand, and that I was betraying my country, I was a traitor, but I never believed any of that, I love living, I love my country, I love the world, so I didn't buy it, it didn't hurt me so much because I didn't buy it. When they would say, your son wouldn't want you to do this.
The first thing my stepfather did was, before I even told him the story, he just hugged me. And he was glad I was back, that was really surprising. Really the same with my mom. They wanted me to not say it was political, and just to say I was tired and wanted to come home and all these things, that they might be more lenient.
If I can articulate what I believe is right and what I know that is in the hearts of other people. I've had people come up to me and say, they'll whisper to me, you speak for me, you're saying the right thing. It's like, okay, thank you, because I understand that you might be afraid to say, or you don't feel you could, but I will do that, and I'll take your encouragement and use it.
Mental illness is not something everybody understands, and I know it takes a toll on the family. When somebody is sick, mentally ill, it takes a toll on the family. So one wonders how much support the family also needs in order to cope with the person that is showing all these symptoms. Because, often it involves, like I said, using illegal substances, drinking alcohol, not sleeping well, and sometimes there might be some violence even, those kind of issues. And how do you respond to that? And how do you provide the support that the person needs?
A lot of the women I know have had cervical cancer, breast cancer, just lots of ailments. We talk about it amongst ourselves, and we know that it's stress related, because it has to be. You're up at night getting phone calls. You can't work all day because you're a wreck, and that takes a toll on your system. And after 3 or 4 deployments of your child, I myself have had, very bad health issues since he left.
The family also has to cope with the changes that the person will have as a result of having been exposed to traumatic events, as a result of experiencing trauma, etc. So there have to be multiple interventions in order to provide the person with the appropriate help.
Each time a soldier is sent to war, he himself, his parents, and other family members are struck by severe tensions. They are separated, fretfully wondering whether they will ever be able to see each other again.
He was trying to be upbeat, he didn't want us to worry about him. He missed us, and he was tired. He was, he wouldn't tell me he was scared. But
as a mother, you could hear it.
Yeah, I could hear it, and I knew that he was and he really missed he has a son, he really missed his son, you know, and his wife. But I think what he was trying to do was make the best out of the situation, and he befriended Iraqi kids, and he would get candy to give to the kids and try to, you know. I mean, he was not one of those kind of people who was militant or a warrior, you know, kind of character. He was a really big guy. He was 6'4", but he was really kind of gentle-hearted and always try to make people laugh.
You know, living through other periods of time, I don't remember military families standing up against wars. Normally, it was either the veterans who were war resistors or who were whistleblowers, but not really family members. Family members always stayed in the background.
The bottom line is that's what the most important thing. To have somebody else to cry on their shoulders, to get your anger and frustration out, is the most important thing amongst military families. Because, as I said at the beginning, most people don't understand what you're going through, okay? They can't. So yeah, we talk about the good times, we talk about the bad times, we talk about how we take the next step to the next day. How are we going to get through that next day? Does that next day have a meaning, a special meaning?
The last time that I came home on leave and saw my family and looked at them like, I might not see you again, that's when it really got intense. And I said, I will never come home until this is done.
As a matter of fact, he was the first guardsman, the first National Guardsman from Pennsylvania to have been killed since 1945. So all those times he told me, don't worry, the National Guard never goes to war and people in the Guard don't get killed. He's the first.
I mean, when you start speaking out against a war, you're labeled, treasonous, unpatriotic, crazy. I mean, you just automatically get a label saying.
I'm not saying that it's the one thing, but it helps to have some others that you know have been through this experience that you can call, laugh, and cry with. Because unless you have gone, and I'm going to go now to death, unless you have had the death of a child, which you should never experience because I don't wish it on you, okay? You have no idea what it is. Normal progression of life is your parents go first. Your children don't go before you. And that's the difference. There's a big, big, big difference there.
I think you'll talk to any military member and they'll tell you, we're going to do anything it takes to get home. I want to see my wife and kids. I want to see my girlfriend and boyfriend. I want to see my mom and dad.
One of the serious problems that the Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans face is unemployment. They are easily dismissed from their previous jobs, and after returning from war, they are not entitled to go back to the jobs they had before.
In terms of people that were small company owners and they got called up in the National Guard and Reserve, especially people like doctors, people that had CPA firms or marketing firms, people where you've got to count on a small cabal of customers, and you get called away for a year and a half, those customers aren't waiting for you to come back after 18 months. They go start doing business with someone else, which means that you go out of business.
Well, they feel as though they've given their lives for their country. Many of them have lost the physical capacity to do something. Some of them lost arms and legs. Some of them have lost mental capacity. And in exchange for that, their country has basically turned their back on them.
We do have a big problem in the younger veterans, particularly those in the National Guard, because of the 2-year call-up policy that the Department of Defense has. A lot of companies don't want to hire you if you were in the, say, Georgia National Guard, because you're going to be gone for 2 years. and they can't run their company with you being pulled up and gone. And that's why the unemployment rate with the younger veterans is actually someplace in the 20% range.
I do not think that soldiers and Marines who are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan are being properly served. I think they're just getting over-medicated and treated like problems, and they're getting thrown in jail, and they're getting kicked out of the Army without benefits. And it is a problem that goes on and on and on, and it's a real scourge.
Some veteran soldiers suffer severe physical and movement impairments. Some others come home with mental disorders.
I know that I have to. I guess I really don't have a choice either way. I mean, I suppose I could live off of my disability compensation from the VA by myself, but if I have hopes of having a family, I need to go out and work to support them.
And yet they were suddenly forced to go into other people's lands, people whose language they didn't speak, the culture they didn't understand, and they didn't want to be occupiers. Other veterans were so traumatized that they began a terrible kind of mental and psychological illness that affected them and their families. They couldn't understand or control what we call post-traumatic stress. This has affected hundreds of thousands of people.
So if you're talking about 20% of 2 million people, that's 400,000 people who will be looking for mental health care. I've heard stories from my veteran friends that it's very, very difficult to get an appointment.
You add up what it takes to treat somebody as an outpatient, where you do a lot of preventive work, by the way, as opposed to hospitalize them, which is much more expensive, or the third option, they end up incarcerated in this country. Yeah. Almost always a lot of mentally, now, you know, the number of mentally ill people that are behind bars is incredible.
I've had a few friends that have gone for employment with local law enforcement agencies or federal law enforcement agencies that have actually been denied because of their experiences in Iraq or Afghanistan, even though that goes to their credit. A lot of those agencies would rather have someone fresh out of high school, fresh out of college, that doesn't have, I guess, a war taint on them.
Unemployment then leads to the homelessness of U.S. veterans returning from the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, in different cities along many streets in the U.S., you see veterans back from war, homeless because they do not have a job.
You can walk up and down these streets of D.C. and at any given time see dozens of homeless men and women, and the majority of them were in the military. You know, the U.S. government has forgotten about them after it gets all it can from them and uses them to oppress and destroy people in other countries. It leaves them here on the streets to die.
For every 100 soldiers coming back, there are far more who are injured. So the injured veteran is the one who is most likely to become homeless because they will either, in some cases, succumb to substance abuse problems. They may have a mental health problem that at some point will fracture their home life. There are a lot of different reasons for people becoming homeless, but we can almost guarantee you that the number will increase.
It is a violation of every principle of this country that there should be homeless veterans sleeping on the streets of our cities. It is a violation of all our principles that we don't find jobs for veterans when they come home, that we have all the money in the world to spend on bombs and the latest kind of weapons of destruction, but we don't have money to even take care of our veterans when they come home.
The American people are now well aware of the horrific effects and consequences of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The financial situation and economic corruption of Wall Street has plagued everyone.
We have cities and states almost going bankrupt every day. We have teachers that are being fired or laid off because we can't afford to have them educating our children. And so when the American people look at all of these issues together, they're trying to say, how much can we afford to spend on defense, on the military, on economic issues, on jobs, and on Iraq, and on Afghanistan.
You know, they continue to make them Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans, and when they come home, you know, it's a big world, and especially in a country that during this
this terrible recession, while the bankers and the rich are getting bailed out, people on the streets are, they're dying. People are losing their homes.
And I told them about how many soldiers are getting psychotropic drugs who are in country, and how dangerous that is to everybody. And they seem to not know that, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then when we talked about Afghanistan, they said, well, we disagree with you. We have a mission there, and we're gonna fulfill the mission there. And we said, it's the same story. You can't win this with the way that you're trying to win this. And so they agreed to disagree with us, right? It was very disappointing to me, because I thought that they were smarter.
Or I go out, to all my protests, I'm always loading up my car with something, and they would ask me, like, why do you do this? And I'm like, because we're wrong. We're killing innocent people, and our soldiers are dying for nothing.
Look back at how the veterans of Vietnam were treated. They were treated like garbage. People would spit on them. They had no respect for them. Their homelessness, their truancy, everything was despicable. Okay? We did not want our soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, more Iraq at that point, now Afghanistan, coming back and feeling like they aren't being honored, okay? And not to be treated the way the Vietnam veterans were treated.
That's why I tell it. That's why I keep telling it and telling it. Because I want people to understand how stupid and such a terrible loss of all the lives that are lost for no good reason, for nothing that anybody can now justify. There is no justification. It was a terrible, deliberate mistake.
I mean, I was lucky my son is home. He came home. He's badly scarred from his tours.
My son is very close to me, okay? Yeah, this is his sweater, okay? I always try to make sure that there's something that makes me happy. Upstairs, where I told you my den is, on my roll-top desk is a picture of my son, my husband, my son, my daughter, my grandson, and a little drawing that my grandson made, okay? I go up there, and that's my sanctuary. My son is there. My husband is there.
That's after Sher was killed, and our whole family became very involved. And that was his dad, who since has died. And that was a sign that he made to carry. And I have a big sign that I carry that just has Sher's face on it, and it says, "We mourn Sergeant Sherwood Baker." So we spoke out before he was killed, and when he was killed, we sat here that night and we made a decision that nobody was going to take his death and wrap flags around it and call it good. And we knew it was wrong. We know it was a terrible waste of a good life, and that if we would honor him by speaking out against what we knew was wrong.
If you're asking me about parents having their children join the military, I would say to you and to them, think twice. Think 3 times. Think 4 times.
First of all, we can't forget the people who were lost, all the people. The soldiers, the Iraqis, the Afghan people, the lives that will never be full, and all the people who grieve for those lives. And to not forget our responsibility as human beings to care for each other, to stand for each other, and to speak and work against war. And that war is a betrayal of God's plan for us. And we're compelled to speak against it.